We've been following the story of a former correctional officer at High Desert State Prison who was charged with involuntary manslaughter for the shooting death of an inmate in 2014. The High Desert incident was not the first shooting in a Nevada prison, and according to some, Nevada's use of guns inside its prisons is a bit unusual. Earlier this week, we interviewed Howard Skolnick. He's the former director of the Nevada Department of Corrections who retired in 2011. He told us about some of the challenges he faced as director of a department that's notoriously overlooked by state lawmakers. But the Nevada Department of Corrections has a new director. Jim Zarenda became director on April 4th. Jim, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Jim, you come from a law enforcement career spanning some 30 years, and most of that was in Connecticut, where you worked your way up the ladder to commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Corrections. So my first question is, why did you decide to come to Nevada?
Well, actually, the very first thing I needed to do was to try to see how I can appease my wife. A lot of my wife's family and friends are out in California and Phoenix, Arizona. So when I was growing up in corrections, she was always telling me she wanted to move out west. And I told her, okay, when I retire, we could start thinking about moving out west. Well, when I retired, I ended up taking a position in New York City as First Deputy Commissioner in New York City Department of Corrections, and she wanted to know what happened to west. That's not exactly far west that I was thinking. It was west of Connecticut, but not far enough. So, you know, she sacrificed a lot while I was working in Connecticut to stay there and do what I wanted to do to help the family, and now I think it's time I got to start helping her out.
So you moved here for her, but you also moved from the East Coast, which is, to a lot of us in the West, progressively much more liberal, maybe in the way they deal with prison systems, to Nevada, which is this landlocked area which for decades was sort of isolated, does things its own ways. I wonder how big a change that's been so far.
You know what, it's enormous, and I've done a lot of studies throughout the country on different systems, 32 different systems to be exact. I worked with ASCA, I worked with the National Governors Association, I've worked with National Institute of Corrections, and I was fortunate enough to see how a lot of systems around the country work. So you start seeing what works, what doesn't. I see a lot of things in Nevada that I really do want to see myself educate the public and educate the legislators, educate the staff on what I think is really going to work. And what I mean by work is things that are going to reduce victimization in our communities. And that's my number one goal is how do I, as my position, affect the residents in this state to be able to reduce victimization in our state.
What's the best way to do that?
You know, starting with day one, when inmates walk in our door, we have to start thinking about reentry into the community. When you look at the state of Nevada right now, they look at reentry as, okay, you have an inmate with 18 months left of his sentence. All right, he has 90 days left of his sentence. You know, we got to start thinking, inmate just came in our door, he's going to be going home, he or she. And that's when we have to start saying that we have to start reentry and start figuring out how do we use best practices and programs out there to change inmates' behavior, change inmates' addiction before they go home, so when they go out in the community, which they will be going out there, and we could reduce recidivism and victimization so our families are safer.
You know, I've said this to other state officials before, and I'll say it to you as well. I've been a reporter for 2 decades here. Maybe I'm cynical. What you're saying sounds like sort of a progressive way of dealing with inmates in the prison system. What makes you think you can do it in Nevada, where I've seen things change very, very slowly, if at all?
You know what, and that's what I mean about education. That's where I have to start, and it's not something I could say we're going to do it right now because I know that's not realistic. But I have to start, and I do this all the time when I'm testifying up at legislation or talking to the public, talking to staff. I go around a facility telling staff how we're going to do this. And yes, it's going to start costing money down the road because you got to start investing on the front end, where we will eventually start saving money to be able to reinvest in other programs and reinvest in things that are going to make more sense. You can't expect an inmate to come in our front door and leave any better than he or she is if we did nothing. And that feels like what we're doing now. I know we have a lot of programs in place, but we don't have enough. We don't have enough resources to be able to make offenders successful. We don't have enough continuity of care in the community that we're going to be facing when we do release offenders. That, to me, is going to be a disaster waiting to happen with victimization in the community. And I do think if I can make an impact, it'll help me with feeling that I am doing better for my family that are eventually going to be here, or even the community in itself. And I think that's really important to be able to explain to people and how we're going to get there.
Earlier this week, we interviewed Howard Skolnick, former director of the Nevada Department of Corrections, as we stated earlier. And he said you're going to have your hands full. And one of the issues we talked about was use of force. The High Desert State Prison shooting was one of a series of high-profile conflicts, which eventually led to the resignation of former Director Greg Cox. What's your take on use of force in the prison system?
You know, I drafted the actual policy that's in court litigation right now for New York City for use of force, and I've studied a lot of use of force around different departments around the country, especially when it terms with administrative segregation and isolation. To me, one of the things the governor tasked me for is my priority has to be looked at on how do we handle use of force in the facilities. What do we do with what they call the Birdshot round with controlling population inside the facilities? So I've been doing that since day one, is looking at what do we do with the Birdshot. To me, I don't think it's necessary. I'm not saying it's going to be eliminated, but I'm going to temporarily take it offline because I think there are better things out in the world today that we can use for controlling inmate population than using a Birdshot.
What are some of those things?
You know, there's even if we stay with a non-lethal round of munitions, which there are a lot of different things out there that won't do the damage that a Birdshot can do, but can do the amount of force necessary to control things. You're talking there's bean bags, there's rubber, there's plastic, there's things that are not designed to be lethal, but actually can control populations. And the shotgun itself, I don't know if there's many agencies around the country that actually still use a 12-gauge shotgun. Most of them use different other types of rounds of ammunitions that go from either a 37 millimeter or 40 millimeter that can actually use more gas. They could have a projectile gas rather than munition. And I think that's important because it's not going to do as much damage, but it will actually do the same amount of effect. And that's what I'm going to be doing research on with a committee to see what we can do better for that.
So you think the use of Birdshot is a bit antiquated?
I do. I don't know of any system I've ever been in around the country that actually uses it inside the grounds.
Related to the Birdshot, you said you were going to temporarily take it offline. Do you know when that might happen?
I'm hoping that by the end of this week.
Do you think you'll see any resistance to that?
You know, there's going to be pros and cons to doing that with staff, what they're in their mind. And that's why I'm doing it temporarily and setting up a committee to really look at it. I can't say I want it off the line permanently. I can't say I don't want it off the line until I really know the system well enough. And that's why you set up these committees before making things permanent, because there may be things I'm not thinking of. Right now, if I had to make a decision right away, I don't think it's necessary, but I might be missing something because I haven't studied the Nevada system that long. And that's what you have these committees to be able to bring the pros and cons to my attention so that I can make the appropriate decision.
It sounds like you might have had a bit of culture shock coming here.
No, it still is. I mean, it's not only what they actually do with policy, but it's also the distance between each facility becomes a challenge because it's almost like you're dealing with two different worlds, two different states, even though it's the same state. It's easier to unify a system when everything's close by because it's easier to monitor, it's easier to audit. But when you have facilities that are literally 10, 12-hour drive away, those are going to be a little more tricky to manage because you have to make sure that the staff you have on board are on the same page as you.
I want to play you part of the interview we had with Howard Skolnick. This is what he told us about his struggles with the state's legislative body to get them to act.
The Department of Corrections and before that the Department of Prisons have never been treated well by the Nevada State Legislature. If you look at everything from the staffing patterns to the replacement for sick leave, vacation, it's always been way under where the national standards have been. When I left, Nevada had the lowest ratio of correctional officers to inmates in the United States. I don't anticipate that it's gotten any better. If anything, it's probably worse.
James Zarenda, new director of the Department of Corrections in Nevada. You've only been director for a little over a month, so I'm going to cut you some slack here. But do you think it is worse here than in other states?
You know, every state has its own issues. I don't, as was just mentioned, I don't blame the legislators. It's the constituents that drive the legislators. It's not the legislators themselves. And that's where I really do think I, as part of the agency director, has to do the education to the public. When you looked at the history of corrections, legislators don't tend to funnel a lot of money or resources into corrections because they look at offenders as the dregs of society. And these are the people we don't want to spend money on because they've already victimized.
How do you see offenders? How do you view them?
You know what? Whether I look at them as people or not, they are going to be released into our communities. And that's why the education to the public is no matter how we feel about an offender, those are going back into our communities. And if we don't funnel resources to do better for them, we're just going to re-victimize our community. And we have to care about our families and our community in order to understand that we have to do a better job with the reentry, with the programs, with doing things that'll change behavior. And the only way to do that is through money, because you're going to need to purchase these programs and staff to do this. And the legislators in the past didn't want to do that because the constituents didn't think that was important. I mean, obviously, the big important things today in the state of Nevada is education to our regular public. Well, that is important, but also we got to look at when you release offenders into the community, you're going to have to deal with what the repercussions of if we don't do anything with them. And if you take a snapshot today and you don't arrest any offender ever again, and anyone in the public ever again, there's 13,500 inmates in the system right now. 88% of those offenders have less than 20-year sentences. So what does that mean to everybody? It means that 12,000 offenders are being released into our community pretty soon. That's if you arrest nobody. So that's a lot of people that it's going to have effect on our communities if we don't do anything about it.
Do you think there's a direct cause and effect between the amount of education somebody has in the prison system and their recidivism rate?
You know what? They do. Education does play a big piece in recidivism. But when you're talking about the addictions that are out in the communities with these crystal meth and heroin addictions, those will outweigh any education to give to anybody. So we have to try to first see what is our most important problems we face in the community that are causing victimization and work it back into our facilities on where I want to send the resources to be able to change that behavior, whether it's addiction behavior. I mean, there's a lot of things out there that we have to start looking at. There's a medication called Vivitrol. That medication is actually geared to changing addicted behaviors in the mind. Now, why we don't use this, I don't know, but those are things we need to look at before we're releasing offenders in the community that may reduce victimization that's related to addictions. So there are things out there we got to start really doing a better job on how we're going to be changing the behavior so when they get out there, that behavior that's driving the victimization in the community goes down.
I want to mention a statistic that the Department of Corrections released in 2015. It showed a 24% increase in the prison population from 2003 to 2013 here, which brings up the question, the population stands at around, correct me if I'm wrong, 13,000 inmates. Are our prisons staffed and equipped well enough to handle that many people?
You know what, even if they're not staffed for that, you can create overtime to make the staffing all right. If you're talking about no overtime, no, it's not. But we don't leave areas that are going to be vacant with nobody working there. So we'll cover it with overtime, make sure it's appropriately staffed. I just think it's not appropriately programmed. So you're not having enough of these program behavioral changes, these dialectic behavioral therapy programs that can change actual behavior. Those are the things that are going to make long-term impacts on even budgets. Better job we do at preparing inmates for society, less crime there will be.
And you think you could convince lawmakers of that? Let's spend this money now so we don't have recidivism 5 to 10 years down the road. It will actually save us money to think more about the future instead of the immediate impact.
What I'm doing now is telling them this, teaching them this, but they're not going to believe it till they start seeing performance measures that are done outside of Nevada. And I could provide that, and I will get that. So I could show visuals on the impacts it's going to make and how much long-term cost savings it's going to be based on reduction of recidivism. But you also have to look at the crime rate in Nevada. If you look at our population, 25% of our population are not Nevadian residents. So that plays an impact on the crime rate here and the releases and recidivism rates in our state. I don't know if that's good or bad, but when you talk about 25%, that means a lot of the criminals or offenders that are being released in other states are coming to Nevada for one reason or another, and that's going to affect our crime rates in the city.
The former director and the interim director of the Department of Corrections weren't really inclined to talk to the media, and they declined numerous requests from us for interviews on this show. Do you plan to try to increase the transparency of the department?
You know what? I think that's the big part of education to the public and to the legislators. I need media to be able to help me spread the word out into the community. And if I truly believe in what I'm doing, I think it's important that I tell people what I'm doing. And also, it's good to hear from people if they think I'm going in the wrong direction, because then it makes you think. It makes you think, am I not? And it also helps me to be able to know where I got to study more and research around the country to be able to understand if we're going in the right direction. But I think the public needs to see where we're going. Think they need to see what my mission is. I mean, I am publicly funded to my position, so the public is paying for me. So I think it's important that the public hears what they're paying for.
This is the last question. I'll leave it kind of open-ended. What's the biggest challenge facing NDOC?
The biggest challenge is the staffing. Is difficult to staff certain areas around the state, to me, because everything else is just policy-driven. I could change things and change direction of the agency by policy. But the staffing in certain places of the state, like Ely, I mean, very difficult to find staff to work there. That becomes a challenge. And it's not only a challenge when you're talking about security staff, but you're talking about medical, mental health, those services that are very important to progress and trying to make offenders better, even when they're being discharged back in the community. To get those type of medical, mental health services up there are very difficult, because there's not many people that are living up there or even want to live up that way for whatever reason they have on their agenda. It's hard for me to get staff there, and that's a very difficult from a concept for me to understand. I'm not used to with such a small state as like Connecticut or a small area as New York City. I just want everybody to know that, you know, my mission for the agency is the mission to make the residents in the state feel safer, and to know that we are here to make sure that we do the best we could to reduce victimization in the community. And if we're not there, we're going to be there.
James Zarenda is the new director of the Nevada Department of Corrections. He started April 4th. Jim Zarenda, thanks for joining us.
Hey, I appreciate it, and hopefully I'll be back again.